planet has been around for a really long time, approximately 4.6 billion years, and about 4.4 billion years after its inception, continental plates began colliding and creating what we now know as Europe. But at the time, Britain wasn't an isle just yet, as it was connected to the European mainland. The soon-to-be islands were a part of a continent-stretching plain going from Russia to the Atlantic coastline. Ian Morris, author of Geography is Destiny, Britain and the World, a 10,000-Year History, calls this plain Proto-Britain.
The last 2.5 million years have been filled with ice ages. Glaciers during these times sucked water out of the oceans, while ice sheets up to 3 kilometers thick, or 1.8 miles, covered the northern hemisphere. Yes, I will be providing conversions in miles because what the fuck is a kilometer? These masses of frozen water were so abundant that the sea level lowered over 100 meters. It would take some time before human ancestors would arrive on Britannia, however, as the surrounding glaciers locked up so much moisture that at certain points, this area would only receive a fifth of the rainfall it sees today. With an ice sheet covering all of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and northern England, this place was inhospitable to even most wildlife, not just humans.
And how about them humans? Well, as we know, humans evolved in East Africa's savannas about 2.5 million years ago and quickly spread out from there. But there was a problem. Whew! It was too darn cold. Humans had to wait for wetter, warmer periods to spread out, which caused human migration to be more gradual. But about 1 million years ago, one of these warm periods popped up and humans migrated into Proto-Britain for the first time. Humans passed into Proto-Britain through an area known as Doggerland, which, due to the ice caps being so large and sucking up so much ocean water, it was a giant unsubmerged area that connected the British Isles to the European mainland. Homo sapiens and Neanderthals arrived in Proto-Britain around 300,000 to 35,000 years ago, and they spent that time spreading through the lands and creating cool cave art like this. Let's skip ahead a bit to about 1000 BC. Hello.
Yes, Mr. Austin, sir. I was just wondering what happened during those thousands of years that we just skipped over.
Great question, my valued student. What did humans do in those thousands of years that we just skipped over? They spent most of their time killing each other. Oh, and Stonehenge. Yeah, that.
Oh, yes.
Stonehenge, yeah. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Alright. Bye-bye now.
Goodbye.
Bye. Is he gone? I think he's gone. Was that monkey just talking to me? I don't even think he's enrolled in my class. Can we look into that? Okay, thank you. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen.
Before the arrival of a certain group of people who were busy taking over the known world, the island was in a period known as the British Iron Age. The groups, often referred to as tribes, have been thought to be mainly Celtic, although this has been disputed recently. As the world surrounding Britain continued to innovate and expand, the Isle lagged behind. Ian Morris calls Britain at this time Europe's poor cousin, which would be its identity for thousands of years. There were a few things the Brits were especially good at, however. They really knew how to farm. After the arrival of agriculture from the Middle East around 4200 BCE, the people of the British Isle began to cover every inch of land possible with crops, planting and plowing their way at an average speed of 1 kilometer a year. When new technology would appear on the Isle, it was almost always from the Mediterranean region, such as iron. People around the Mediterranean had been smelting iron since 4000 BCE, but it didn't reach the Isle until around 700 BCE. This trend of extremely late arrivals of brand new technologies is one of the reasons why Britain stayed so underdeveloped.
During this time, many Celtic tribes lived in Britain. Not too much is known about them because most of their accounts were only recorded by some Roman scholars and most of them have been lost to history. For example, the Dumnoni tribe in what is now southern Scotland only had one account ever recorded of them, and it was by an Alexandrian mathematician and astronomer named Ptolemy. Oh, check it out! It looks like he created a map of the British Isles. Oh, that's not very accurate. Okay, yeah, geography and cartography wasn't the most accurate science back in the day. People are really interrupting. Who could that be? Oh, it's Pythias! Pythias was a Greek merchant who came to the British Isles in 325 BC to the land of the Picts. He later named this land Britanniae, which is the origin for the name Britain. That's pretty cool. Okay. I know I've been meandering. Let's get to the real meat and potatoes. Or should I say, the beans and toast. I think we're all wondering, where are the Romans? Well, we're gonna have to go back in time a little bit to talk about them.
We're in Western Europe around 125 BCE. Rome has grown from a small regional power in the Italian peninsula to a decently large regional power outside of Italy, and they began to have a larger presence in this region known as Gaul. This region was notorious at the time for being difficult to access, let alone invade. But this began to change after 200 BCE, when Roman armies pushed their way into the interior of Spain, and Italian traders began to open up Gaul. Things get a little more complicated from here, so I'm going to try and be clear and concise.
The people living in Gaul saw what Rome was doing in the south, and it rightfully scared the living shit out of them. So in order to resist invasion and also profit from Italian traders, populations began flocking to cities of several thousand people. Rome saw this, and they weren't very happy, as they thought it could hurt their interests. In 125 BCE, a mostly Greek kingdom known as Marseille asked Rome for help against tribes that had been pestering them. Rome agreed, and saw Marseille as an ally, and they ended up defeating these tribes. But just for good measure, they set up a fort. Nothing really conspicuous about that at all. Except a nearby tribe called the Arverni thought Rome was getting a little too big for their britches. In response, their leader, Boudica, their leader, Bituitos, formed a federation to keep Rome at bay. This action was quite alarming to the Romans, who eventually invaded and annexed the Arverni. And they thought, what the hell, and annexed everything from the Pyrenees to the Alps. And, just for good measure, they conquered Gaul in just about 8 years. Real quick, let's talk about this guy. What's his name again? Oh, Julius Caesar. No. Julius Caesar, like the salad. Gotcha. I apologize for that, my bad. Caesar spent many years trying to climb up the Roman political ladder and took some massive loans to fund his political campaigns. And in 59 BCE, he was in horribly crippling debt. To get out of this, he made a deal to start commanding an army in the Balkans, do army stuff, annex a kingdom or two, plunder all that money back. But then, things changed when the Roman Senate put him in charge of an army in southern Gaul, and he saw opportunity here.
After casually conquering Gaul, Caesar saw much economic and strategic opportunity in the English Channel. The Channel was an important strategic area due to it being a flank against whoever owned the land on the north side of Gaul. Many Gaelic people and leaders had crossed over the Channel during the Roman invasion, and Caesar saw them as a threat. His only choice was to take control of the north side of the Channel, preventing any enemy from sailing through it. The first step in his plan was to move against a tribe called the Veneti in the north of Gaul in 56 BCE, as they had the strongest fleet. After some initial struggle, Caesar and the Romans eventually won, killing the Veneti's chiefs and selling almost everyone else into slavery, just for good measure. He could now turn his eyes across the Channel. The leaders in Britain saw this and began to scramble for as much power as they could grab, in order to prevent the inevitable Roman invasion. Civil wars broke out between pro- and anti-Roman factions, but this struggle was ultimately futile. Late in the summer of 55 BCE, Caesar sent a Gaelic army across the Channel to, quote, approach what communities he could and urge them to choose loyalty to the Roman people. His message? Caesar is coming. Soon. I just had to let that marinate for a sec, because that is some of the coldest shit I have ever heard.
It's pretty easy to imagine Caesar and his army being incredibly successful, like 2017 Warriors type of dominance, but in reality, it was a little more complicated than that. One thing that was really important to know when pertaining to naval warfare back then was understanding tidal and wind patterns. And if there's one thing Caesar didn't know much about, it was the English Channel's tidal and wind patterns. You can imagine how this would go badly.
In 55 BCE, Caesar's first campaign began. The struggles began at the very start, as before the Romans could even leave the shores of Boulogne in northern Gaul, their horses did not comply with getting into the cavalry transports, causing them to miss the tide. When the other ships managed to get within sight of the Isle, the winds changed, and they were thrown all over the channel. Not a great start, but it gets even worse for the invaders. It turned out Caesar's ships were too large to get close enough to shore, and his soldiers needed to jump into neck-deep water in full armor and slowly approach the beach, which was probably at Pegwell Bay in Kent. Even Caesar himself had to acknowledge the logistical nightmare that was occurring, saying, quote, "This was the one action in which my previous good fortune was found lacking."
After the invasion finally reached the shore, which probably took a really long time considering Roman armor weighed around 10 kilos or 22 pounds, the Romans made really quick work of the fight. But because their horses were stubborn and couldn't join them, they couldn't pursue the fleeing Britons with their cavalry. Here's yet another oopsie on Caesar's part. He had no knowledge of British tides, and as soon as the tide rose, it scattered his ships all over the place, which were then damaged by a storm. Not a great day for my boy Julius. But after a little bit of this, a little bit of that, by that I mean threatening and skirmishing and killing the locals, they struck a deal with the locals, and then escaped in hastily repaired ships back to the Gaelic coast as soon as they could. Little side note, doing all this research really puts in perspective for me just how slow warfare was back then. It took Caesar 8 years to conquer Gaul, while it took this silly little mustache man 6 weeks to conquer the same region. Really shows you how far technology has come. I'm saying this because in 55 BCE, the Romans escaped the British Isles, and they waited until the next summer to do it again. But this time, Caesar came ready.
Caesar came steamrolling back with 3 times as many men, with cavalry and custom-built landing craft. He was going to make sure things went right this time. Initially, the southeastern tribes rallied behind a rising anti-Roman king named Cassivellaunus. But the alliance soon faded as it became clear that nothing could stop the great Roman tidal wave. Eventually, Cassivellaunus and his allies had to give in, and sought terms with Caesar, in which he declared another victory and left the Isle. Britain had officially been conquered. After this, Caesar went home and had a 20-day-long festival thrown for him. There is something we need to understand about how Rome kept control over a region, however. They loved what they called friendly kings. In Britain's case, Caesar appointed a man named Mandubracius as king of a federation in southern Britain known as the Eastern Kingdom, while the Southern Kingdom was also established. The story behind Mandubracius is actually pretty important. When Caesar conquered Gaul and was sitting on the northern shores looking over the English Channel, he was approached by Mandubracius, who had fled Cassivellaunus, the anti-Roman king, after he had murdered his father and had overthrown him. He begged Caesar to reinstate him, and his request was accepted. Caesar's plan was to hold on to his promise, and when he eventually conquered Britain, he reinstated Mandubracius and gave him the title as King of the Eastern Kingdom, along with some fancy stuff and kinda maybe promising Roman support. Caesar did this because simply invading and keeping order on the Isle would have cost a fortune, but appointing Mandubracius cost almost nothing, and in exchange he had a loyal king in the region who would bully neighboring tribes into refusing refuge to Gaelic rebels, which in turn closed Caesar's flank and secured the English Channel. Pretty smart, Julius. I respect it. While Caesar was off doing Caesar things in Rome, you know, big things were happening in Britain. Romanomania began spreading through the Isle as Roman-appointed kings were forced to embrace continental European traditions and values, and relied on Rome to keep their positions safe. They had power, but it was delicate. Britain began seeing European imports and Roman-minted coins by the 20s BCE. A tomb of what is believed to be the cremated remains of Mandubracius' royal descendant Tassiovanus contained things like Italian horse fittings, a silver medallion of the emperor, a suit of Roman chainmail, and wine. Of course. The Roman effect took over the hearts and minds of the wealthy, as European imports began to be seen as luxury as prices soared, which drew Gaelic traders to the Thames region. This new ruling class began to create Britain's first quote-unquote real governments, which strengthened ties between the Isle and the greater continent, while creating imbalance between conquered and unconquered Britain.
During this time, we actually begin to see history repeat itself. During the 20s and 30s CE, the Eastern Kingdom started taking away territory from its tribal neighbors. Like many of the Celtic tribes 50 years earlier, like the Dubini, the Durotriges, Iceni, and the Corioltavi, please put up the disclaimer again, started creating their own kingdoms. They created them either to have a better chance at joining the cool kids club that was the Roman Empire, or to resist it altogether. Eventually, our boy Julius got himself murked by his homie Brutus, because he didn't check himself before he wrecked himself, asked for a salad to be named after him, all that. We all know the story. But after that, a few years of civil war broke out in Rome. But eventually, Caesar's nephew Augustus came into power and reinstated the Roman Republic. I use heavy air quotes there, because in reality, he kept all the power for himself and made himself Rome's first autocrat. You can't fool me, Augustus. I know what you're on about. Every now and again, British tribes rose up against Rome and had to be put down with the good old iron fist. Augustus was annoyed by the frequent insubordination and actually considered new military interventions in Britain, but realized they were too expensive and he had way better things to do than just annex more British kingdoms. The threat of Augustus went away when he died. Wow, I really wrote that? Caligula came into power after him. Caligula was actually a nickname that meant little boots because he would wear little soldier boots as a kid. That's cute. He was certainly a character when he was an adult. This is a direct quote from the book Geography is Destiny, again. Caligula's hobbies included dressing up as a god, appointing his horse to a top job in the government, not bad, and engaging in sexual antics that shocked even the worldly Roman elite. Sleeping with his sister was the least of his fables.
This is the guy who currently rules the largest empire in the world. Unsurprisingly, he had his critics and decided that he could repair his already tainted reputation through military campaigns. Being a young ruler, he sought an easy target. Coincidentally, in 38 CE, the ruler of Britain's eastern kingdom, Cunobeline, had a falling out with his son. His son, Adminius, then asked Caligula for help. Cunobeline then died, and the kingdom fell into turmoil, as Adminius's brothers began fighting for control of the kingdom. Caligula thought it would be a great time to intervene on Adminius's behalf. Welcome back to Random Facts about Caligula. This one is surprisingly important. Caligula supposedly had epilepsy that began when he was a child. It probably started as febrile and later cognitive seizures, but later in life, around 37 CE, coincidentally around the same time that Adminius had asked him for help, Caligula suffered status epilepticus, which is when you have a seizure lasting more than 5 minutes, without a return to consciousness between episodes, which can cause serious brain damage. This seizure triggered Caligula to be an epileptic psychosis, which caused him to become psychopathic and paranoid. Some writers also believe that he lived in constant fear of having a seizure, which contributed to these paranoid tendencies.
Why do I mention this? Well, based on accounts of educated aristocrats at the time, which we should take with skepticism, Caligula's invasion of Britain didn't even happen. In 40 CE, he assembled an invasion force in the spring, but unexpectedly cancelled the invasion and ordered his men to begin attacking the ocean and collect seashells as spoils of war, after their imaginary victory.
In the end, Adminius's opinions didn't really matter, as Caligula was dead with only a few months after being murdered by his guards. Probably for the best, if we're being honest. His successor, Claudius, was also interesting, but he was more of an academic, and not as insane, but importantly, he also wanted military glory. Conveniently, Adminius's brothers decided at this time to invade the neighboring pro-Roman southern kingdom, whose king fled to Rome, and Claudius, like Caligula before him, saw that an intervention was the only way to go. So, in 43 CE, Claudius amassed 40,000 men at Boulogne and invaded. The invasion was quite successful. As 11 native kings surrendered, the eastern kingdom was captured, and pro-Roman leaders were instated. Since Roman emperors were the cockiest people ever, Claudius held a victory parade through the captured city of Colchester, with elephants. That's pretty cool. I'll be real.
Claudius's overall plan to outdo Caesar was a little unclear. Some scholars believe that he wanted to create a buffer zone between the southeastern client kings and the rest of the held territory, and some believe that he wanted to move up northwest and begin mining materials like lead and other minerals, which they actually began doing in 49 CE. But if there's one thing that he did have in common with Caesar, it's that his invasion only led to more wars, as Roman infantry began fighting guerrilla wars only 4 years after his invasion in the Welsh mountains. As I said, the intentions of Claudius are still a little bit debated. Another reason he may have invaded was because he was just paranoid about the English Channel flank, But as things kept getting worse, and as kingdoms began dividing between pro and anti-Roman lines, Rome's authority in Britain came into question. After Claudius died in 54 CE, his successor Nero actually considered pulling out of Britain altogether, but ultimately decided not to, as he thought it would undermine his adoptive father's glory that he had earned. What the better decision would have been, pulling out or staying on the Isle, history will never know. But Nero thought maybe if he just pushed a little bit farther north and west, he could create a stable frontier, so he appointed more pro-Roman governors to wage scorched earth war against the Druids. Can we pull up the Druids real quick? No, not those ones. Yeah, that one. Druids were part of the educated class like priests and teachers, and were the center of British resistance. By now, Rome had developed a bit of what Ian Morris calls a good cop, bad cop reputation. For example, they often helped fund British land development, building temples and housing, etc. The groups receiving these gifts saw them as such, as gifts. You know, things that you generally receive for free that have no strings attached. But when there was a string of bankruptcies on the Italian peninsula in the 50s CE, the wealthy who had given these quote-unquote gifts suddenly saw them as loans and demanded insane amounts of money to be paid back. To make things worse for the borrowers in Britain, Nero's financial agent announced that all gifts given by past emperors, including Nero, to chiefs, were suddenly constituted as loans that needed to be paid back immediately. This was bad news for some Britons who had received exorbitant gifts in the past, such as the Iceni. By the way, I feel the need to mention this. Nero was infamously a pretty shitty guy. He one time kicked his wife to death in the stomach while she was pregnant, found a boy on the street that looked like her, had him kidnapped, castrated, and got married to him. That really happened. Look it up. It was also the original neckbeard before it was cool. Prasutagus, the king of the Iceni, was a faithful Roman ally for years. He was such a homie, in fact, that he named Nero as his co-heir, but as soon as he died in 60 CE, his friendship suddenly meant nothing. Rome was a fake-ass friend. The Romans came in and took everything, committing a few atrocities along the way against his family, because we're Rome, I guess why not? This action sparked a rebellion, and while the Roman army was away fighting the Druids in Anglesey, protesters stormed Colchester, the former capital of the Eastern Kingdom, and torched the entire city. Archaeologists even found a large bronze head that may have been of an emperor that had been cut off and thrown into the river. The fires burnt so hot that it melted glass. After this, they began a march on the then capital, Londinium, known today as London, and burned it too. But then, a big question came up. Now what? They had burned the capital, logistically taking back their country, but had no reason to leave the empire. As the Roman army began to rush back from Anglesey, the rebels needed a miracle to win. Non-alcoholic. Don't report me. They got clapped hard. The leader of the rebellion, Boudica, said that the Romans killed over 80,000 Britons and lost only 400 soldiers. Let's be real though, those numbers are most likely inflated by Romans, but the Romans' massacre was so extensive, it even shocked the megalomaniac Emperor Nero. Same guy who took a little boy off the street, castrated, married him because it looked like his wife that he kicked to death. That guy. This event caused a small butterfly effect because the rebels planned to capture Roman grain supplies and didn't plant any of their own. What are you thinking? What? So more Britons ended up starving to death than dying at the hands of Roman soldiers. Nero ended up firing the governor of Britain, but that did little to calm tensions. I am baffled by that. That is... Come on. This really brought up the question again. What the hell were the Romans doing in Britain? They were on an island at the edge of the world, controlling governments they couldn't even keep stable. After 70,000 Romans and Britons died, it took a decade for Britain to regain trust with the Roman government. After Nero not even considering to pull out, the Romans needed a new plan, and fast. The plan they came up with involved appointing another new governor named Agricola in 77 CE.
He was tasked with finding a stable place to set a boundary that would ensure security of Roman interests on the Isle. Pretty much everyone agreed that said security wouldn't manifest unless the Empire held Wales and northern England. Wales at the time was pretty messed up, after Agricola's ancestors had fought to end a civil war there. Agricola in 79 CE marched through Wales, put down a Druid revival, and suggested setting up a border between Firth of Clyde and Forth, which would run through modern-day Glasgow and Edinburgh. Being an ambitious boy, in 81 CE, he even told the emperor that he could invade and hold Ireland with a force of only 10,000 men.
He did eventually send troops to the island, but it was so few that it must have just been a scouting mission. Instead, in 83 CE, he invaded Scotland, and his armies set up forts as far north as Aberdeen. After defeating more northern armies, he suggested to the emperor at the time, Domitian, that they should continue an invasion all the way up to the ocean. If Domitian had followed Agricola's advice, British, hell, even world history could be drastically different. But instead, Domitian decided to not invade because he was jealous of Agricola's glory and wanted to suppress him. Domitian was notoriously unpleasant.
One main, not-so-petty reason the emperor did not take Agricola's advice was due to some external struggles, specifically when he had to take troops out of Britain to defend territory along the River Rhine, even before Agricola's victory in 83 CE. By 85 CE, all of the empire's best troops had been taken out of the Isle and sent to reinforce a Danube territory that had begun to fail. In the end, Domitian, as well as later emperors who had also not decided to push more resources and manpower into developing the British frontier, had made the right call. The empire decided to not take Scotland or Ireland, and the province of Britannia would remain Roman.
What we begin to see from here is actually a somewhat unification between England and Wales under a single ruling class. Most of these people were actually immigrants from Italy and later Gaul and Spain, and as the Roman 1% became the Roman 0.001%, equivalent to billionaires today who monopolize industries, not a single Briton sat on the Senate making decisions about the empire's reach on the Isle.
In the 150 years after Agricola's conquest, Roman writers list up to 8 different wars occurring in Britain, 3 or possibly 5 of which were victories beyond the northern border. It is assumed that the rest of the listed wars occurred within Britannia itself, and probably many more that went undocumented. These wars were mostly due to a sort of military-industrial complex that had taken over politics in Britannia, as further subjugation was felt by the citizens of the island territory. But after this, Britannia saw good fortune. They grew economically, had a good food supply, their population even doubled from 2 to 4 million between the 1st and 4th century. London was becoming the main economic hub in Britannia, with a staggering 30,000 people living there. More people living in cities led to the rise of the urbanite on the Isle. Even the Roman elite began to look upon the British more favorably, seeing them as more civilized, calling them Britanni, which had abandoned its previous negative connotation.
There were a couple epidemics, including an old worldwide one in the 160s CE that was probably related to smallpox. That's neither here nor there. Pandemics are a thing of the past. Knock on wood, very much. But as Britain began to thrive, well, as much as you can thrive before antibiotics, we actually begin to see the rest of the European world fall into turmoil. Civil wars raged in Rome's empire. They had as many as 49 different rulers between 235 and 284 CE. Some died of disease, some died of foreign attacks. At least 40 of them died from other Romans. I swear the highest cause of death for Roman emperors was other Romans. But Britannia, during this time, actually managed to avoid most of the violence.
In 260 CE, a group of Gallic generals thought that they could do a better job than Rome at defending themselves, and both British and Spanish armies joined them. They got spooked back in 274, only for more British officers to reappear in 276. After 6 years, the revolt failed on the continent, but in 286, Britannia declared independence for an apparent third time, and managed to defend themselves for a decade.
This was essentially an ancient Brexit. British governments at the time assumed the Romans would rather keep continental gains than them, so why should they keep sending money to Rome? They weren't objecting against continental rule, rather against ineffective rule. They were doing the worst thing they could possibly do to the Romans. They just get cold. They were unionizing. Oh, I can't even say it. I might need a minute. Around this time, we actually begin to see the British creating an identity not around the Mediterranean, but more around the North Sea. Things somehow get messier from here. An admiral named... God, these names. Claudius was put in charge of a reorganized forts at the Straits of Dover on the Saxon shore. Really cool name, I'm just gonna say it. The Romans beefed this area the hell up with brand new forts that could survive super long sieges. It was also a great area for capturing German pirating ships. So good at it, in fact, that the Roman emperor began to get a little bit greedy.
He demanded a massive share of the...
Pickle? Pickle, please.
Oh my goodness. Here you go, appease the goblin. He demanded a massive share of the goods plundered from these ships. Obviously, Claudius said no, as we all would, and the emperor ordered his execution. Claudius then, say it with me, started a rebellion. And say it with me now, the rebellion failed. But something was different after this. In 296, Rome regained control of Britannia, but things felt weird. It was clear that the old ways were becoming outdated. They essentially said, the future is now, old man, and Rome didn't like that.
Rome began to take most of their troops out of Britannia, mostly the immigrant troops who were stationed in forts and towns. This caused traders to go bankrupt, and many people lost their jobs and city populations began to shrink. Between 250 and 300 CE, 2/3 of London's buildings were just left to rot. Towns in the countryside became slums, as Britannia's golden age quickly came to an end. But things began to get better pretty soon, actually, as local businesses flourished and the rich privatized public goods such as baths and theaters. Some rich people saw this as a return to the old Roman ways, and they didn't like it. They preferred a better, greater, you could say, holier innovation. Who could that be? Come in. You guys are not going to believe this. Yeah, just go up around the side. Can you believe it? It's Jesus! Wow. That's right, Christianity has arrived. It took a while to spread to the countryside where most of the population was, but its effects were massive. During this time, more and more Britons actually began to identify as European as they had a cultural link to the continent. Hey man, before you go, I did some really bad stuff back in Chicago in like '99. I heard you're into forgiveness.
The fall of Roman Britain is described as going out with a bang. It was not very gradual. In the 350 CE, industry, especially in ironworking, fell sharply and suddenly, as large Roman cities were abandoned. It seemed like a paranoia had taken hold across all of Britannia, as labor began going towards defensive things like walls and moats. Wealth began to be sucked into an upper class, and the poor got poorer.
Historians aren't huge fans of using the term Dark Age anymore, but that's essentially what this was. So what happened? For almost 2 centuries, there was a pretty simple consensus. Rome had just lost its power in the region. As city-states began creating new identities and better organizing themselves, they just lost power. The Roman government had been falling apart for a very long time. As territories that originally belonged to Rome saw this, they began to become more independent as they lost faith. Rome had been rotting from the inside, and even the city of Rome itself would be sacked in 410 by the Goths. This explanation is very simple, but it's probably more complicated than that. Britannia was the first territory to really fall when Rome started falling apart, especially as the Franks and Saxons and Germanic tribes began creating better naval technology that made oceans into highways, and Britannia was no longer secure. Generally, Britannia, when it was in trouble, would just call on Big Brother to come and help them, but here's the thing. Big Brother couldn't help. In 408 CE, Saxons began invading and plundering the south and east coasts of the Isle, and Britain called on Rome for help. But Rome's territory in Gaul and Spain was in complete chaos, and they had better things to worry about. Germanic troops were also about to invade the city of Rome itself. The Emperor Heronius saw what was coming, and concluded that Britain was not worth the time to save. In 410 CE, he sent out letters to British elites, telling them to find their own security. Rome had officially backed out of Britain.